Welcome to today's deep dive. We're going to be getting into some really interesting stuff, looking at these excerpts you've shared from ethics and psychology and the mental health professions.
Yeah.
It's like, we always hear about the client's perspective, but this is kind of a peek behind the curtain, right? At the ethical dilemmas that mental health practitioners face every day.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of like getting a glimpse into the other side of the therapy room.
Right, because when you think about it, the core principles, like, they seem pretty straightforward at first glance. Do no harm, respect autonomy. Like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. But then you start reading these real-life cases in the book, and it's like, whoa, those simple principles suddenly become this incredibly complex ethical obstacle course.
Absolutely. And that's the thing about ethical practice. The real world, it rarely offers those clear-cut answers. There's always nuance, always context.
Totally. Like, there's this one case, Don't Call Me Shrink, and I'm reading it, and honestly, my jaw just dropped. This therapist, he completely loses his cool with a client, starts calling him names, and then tells him to go find another therapist. Like, what?
So it's a pretty extreme example, and it really highlights just how quickly things can cross ethical lines, even for experienced therapists. Not only is he harming the client with that outburst, but abruptly dismissing him like that also raises those concerns about client abandonment, which is a serious breach of professional responsibility.
It makes you wonder, like, what could push a therapist to that point? Was it a buildup of something? Did something happen?
That's a good question. I think that's something we all as practitioners grapple with, those moments where we feel our own boundaries being tested.
And the book also talks about this case where a therapist got involved in a child custody evaluation, but it turned out they weren't really qualified to do that kind of assessment. They ended up breaching confidentiality, and there's this huge conflict of interest. Talk about a mess.
Absolutely, and that takes us right to the heart of competence, right? It's not just about having the right degree hanging on the wall. It's about constantly evaluating your own skills, seeking supervision when you need it, and recognizing those situations where you might need to refer a client to someone with more specialized training.
And it makes you think, how do you even define and measure competence, especially as therapy is constantly evolving, right? Like,
Yeah.
with new technologies, new approaches popping up all the time.
It's a great question, and I think it's something that every therapist has to wrestle with throughout their career. It's a career-long commitment to staying informed about new research, attending workshops, and being open to seeking guidance when you encounter a situation that's outside of your experience.
Speaking of new approaches, I know the book mentions the debate about psychologists having prescription privileges. It seems like there's a lot of back and forth about that.
Yeah, there definitely is. On the one hand, you have proponents who argue that it could improve access to mental health care, especially in underserved areas. Being able to address both the psychological and biological aspects of a condition is appealing. But then on the other side, you have concerns about over-medicalizing therapy and what that might mean for the field as a whole.
Right, so it's this balance of weighing potential benefits with the risks.
Exactly. Would it compromise the core values of traditional talk therapy? What about the additional training and education that would be required? It's a really complex issue with no easy answers.
It goes to show that ethical decision-making is about so much more than just knowing the rules, right? It's about being able to navigate these nuanced situations where there might not be a perfect solution.
Right, and sometimes those ethical challenges aren't these big dramatic events, but these everyday situations that test our ability to show up for our clients. Like this one case in the book where a therapist, Dr. Powell, she starts neglecting her clients because she's going through some really intense personal stress.
Oh, wow. So her own struggles are starting to impact her work.
Exactly. She's not taking notes, she's forgetting important details from sessions, and basically just not present with her clients. It really highlights the importance of self-care for therapists. Recognizing when your own issues might be impacting your ability to provide competent care is crucial. Knowing when to seek support, to take a break, that's not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of commitment to your clients and to the profession.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like the saying goes, you can't pour from an empty cup.
Exactly.
This next case really brings home that need for specialized training. It's about this therapist, Dr. Grownup, and he decides he wants to start working with children after primarily working with adults.
Oh, I think I remember this one. And instead of seeking out proper supervision and additional training, he attends like a single weekend workshop.
A weekend workshop.
Seriously. Yeah, and then he just dives right into working with this whole new population with vastly different needs and considerations.
Wow. Children are so much more vulnerable in a therapeutic setting.
Absolutely, and this case really highlights just how important it is for training programs to properly prepare therapists to practice ethically and competently, especially when it comes to working with vulnerable populations. And it also highlights the role of the client, right? Being informed consumers of mental health services, they should feel empowered to ask about a therapist's experience and qualifications, especially when it comes to something as specialized as working with children.
It's true. We talk about doing your research before hiring someone to like remodel your bathroom. But when it comes to mental health, the stakes are so much higher. You're really putting your trust in someone to handle something incredibly delicate.
Absolutely. And that element of trust brings us to one of the cornerstones of therapy. Confidentiality. It seems like a pretty simple concept on the surface, but the cases in this book, oh boy, they reveal just how tricky it can get in real life.
There's this one case that really stuck with me. It's about a therapist, Dr. Salento, who's treating this client whose family is really worried about them. Like they're reaching out to Dr. Salento, desperate for any information, but he's just like shutting them down completely.
This case is such a classic example of the tension between a therapist's ethical duty to protect client confidentiality and those very real concerns of loved ones. And while Dr. Salento is technically correct in maintaining confidentiality, his absolute silence also kind of raises questions about compassion and communication. Even if he couldn't divulge specific details about the client's treatment, he could have at least acknowledged the family's worries, explained his ethical obligations.
Right, like just even recognizing that they're worried, even if you can't say anything specific.
Exactly. And it would have gone a long way in building some trust and understanding. But of course, the case doesn't end there. The client ends up running away, and the family, understandable distraught, files an ethics complaint against Dr. Solano for not, in their view, doing more.
And I'm guessing his response to that complaint didn't really help the situation.
No, not at all. He basically ignores the complaint for months, which just further fuels the family's distress and ends up costing the professional association unnecessary time and resources trying to get a response from him. It's a stark reminder that ethical practice goes beyond just rigidly following the rules. It's also about acting with compassion, with basic professional courtesy, even when facing difficult situations.
It's like that saying, you catch more flies with honey.
Yes.
And speaking of navigating the modern world, the book delves into how technology adds a whole other layer of complexity to this idea of confidentiality.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about it. We've got telehealth, electronic health records, all these new ways that client information is being stored and shared.
Like that case with, what was her name? Lydia Laptop. She accidentally leaves a flash drive with client information on a plane. I mean, can you imagine the feeling in your stomach when you realize you've done that?
Every therapist's worst nightmare. It's a stark reminder that even with something as basic as a flash drive, you have to be so incredibly careful about handling sensitive information.
With online therapy becoming more and more common, I know HIPAA regulations get a whole section in the book.
HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. Yeah, it's essential. It provides this comprehensive framework for protecting client information, especially in this digital age. But it's not just about understanding the regulations, it's about actually implementing them in your practice. Therapists need to be vigilant about things like strong passwords, secure devices, and making sure that any platform they're using for telehealth is fully HIPAA compliant.
Right, so it's this constantly evolving challenge, right? As soon as you figure out one technology or platform, something new pops up.
Exactly. It can feel like a never-ending race to stay ahead of the curve. And then, of course, you have those ethically ambiguous areas where technology might not provide clear answers, like the case about the therapist who tries to barter therapy sessions with a client in exchange for some valuable pottery.
Oh, yeah, Dr. Rembrandt and Mr. Grump, right?
Yeah.
I mean, what could go wrong? It seems harmless enough at first.
Right, but it highlights those murky waters of multiple relationships. Even if bartering seems harmless on the surface, it can so easily create a power imbalance and potentially jeopardize the therapeutic relationship.
It makes you wonder, like, how do you even begin to determine the true value of something like art? What if the therapist ends up scoring this amazing piece while the client feels pressured or exploited in the process?
Precisely. And it's a slippery slope. That's why the book emphasizes the importance of therapists really carefully assessing the potential risks and benefits before entering into any kind of multiple relationship with a client. Whether it's bartering, socializing, or anything that blurs those professional boundaries, you always have to ask yourself, is this truly in the best interest of the client?
It's like this ethical awareness has to be running in the background at all times.
Exactly. It should be like second nature. And that awareness extends beyond just individual clients to how therapists handle things like assessment tools, which can be incredibly powerful, but also really vulnerable to
Let's
misuse.
talk about that. The book really gets into some pretty wild stories about things that can go wrong with assessment.
It really does. I mean, some of them are almost unbelievable.
Like that one with Dr. Luce. He gives this reporter access to an actual personality test, like the actual questions, and some sample interpretations. I feel like I can already see where this is going.
Oh, yeah, this one's a doozy. The reporter ends up publishing the actual test questions along with some really misleading information about what the results mean. It's a complete disaster.
Talk about a PR nightmare.
Yeah.
And then there's Dr. Snitler, who decides to publish a book with real Rorschach ink blots, complete with common responses to them. Talk about giving away the farm.
I know. It seems like common sense, but this case really highlights just how crucial it is to be incredibly careful about discussing psychological tests in any kind of public forum.
So it's not just about administering and interpreting tests ethically, but even just how you talk about them in general.
Right. Even seemingly harmless information can be misused or misinterpreted. And with the growing influence of these commercial testing companies, we have a whole other set of ethical concerns to consider.
The book talks about the Educational Testing Service, ETS. They got into some hot water over, I think it was a student's SAT scores.
Oh, yeah, that was a big one. ETS accused the student of cheating because their scores improved significantly from one test administration to the next. They refused to release the higher score based on some, secret statistical analysis they were using.
That sounds incredibly frustrating for that student, to have your academic future hanging in the balance because of some mysterious algorithm.
It was a whole big debate about transparency and due process, especially when you have these high-stakes tests that can have such a huge impact on a young person's life.
Did they ever end up releasing the score?
The book mentions that the student ended up threatening a lawsuit, and they eventually reached some kind of settlement. But the details were kept confidential, so it's hard to know what really went down.
Oh, so it's like one of those situations where they probably just wanted to sweep it under the rug.
It definitely makes you wonder. And this was all happening before the use of AI really exploded in this space.
Right, and now we've got these algorithms being used not just for scoring, but for everything from test development to identifying students who might need extra support. It seems like there are a lot of ethical gray areas to navigate.
Absolutely. And that's why therapists need to be extra vigilant. Staying up to date on ethical guidelines and best practices for these constantly evolving technologies is crucial. It's not just about using the technology, but using it responsibly.
It's kind of like that saying, just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That whole debate about the implicit association test, the IAT, that's supposed to measure unconscious biases. The book talks about how some companies are now using it for things like diversity training, but there's a lot of debate about whether it's even a valid measure of bias and how easy it is for those results to be misinterpreted.
Yeah, and those interpretations can have real-world consequences.
Absolutely. It all comes back to remembering that ethical assessment, it's not just about following the rules. It's about approaching these tools with a critical and nuanced perspective. It's about weighing the potential benefits against the risks and always prioritizing the well-being of the individuals involved.
So we've talked about ethical dilemmas with clients, with technology, with assessment. The book also touches on those challenges that come with navigating professional relationships. Like, what about dealing with difficult colleagues or handling those sticky student situations that can come up in academia?
It's true, it's easy to get caught up in the client-therapist relationship, but these professional dynamics can present their own set of ethical challenges.
So let's dive into some of those messier interpersonal situations, because I think we've all encountered those at some point in our careers. So the book kicks off this section with a story about these professors, right? They have this little ritual. They get together every week, and they basically just gossip about their students.
Oh, yeah, this one was rough.
Like sharing stories about weird behaviors they've observed, questioning students' answers on quizzes, basically using these students as fodder for their own amusement.
It's a case that really makes you cringe because it highlights how crucial those professional boundaries are, even in those casual settings. I mean, professors, they have this inherent power differential over their students, and to use that power to mock or belittle them, it's a blatant ethical violation.
Yes. It reminds you that words have power, right? Even if you think you're just blowing off steam with colleagues, that those words can really impact a student, damage their reputation, make them feel unsafe, and ultimately that can have a ripple effect on their learning and even their future careers.
Absolutely. And those power dynamics, they become even more complex when you're talking about graduate programs, where students are even more dependent on their professors for recommendations, research opportunities, all of that. The book talks about this situation where a professor, Dr. Jerky, starts a sexual relationship with a graduate student, Miss Switch.
Okay, yeah, I think I remember this one. Talk about a recipe for disaster, right? I mean, mixing those two roles just seems like asking for trouble.
Right. And of course, it doesn't end well. When Miss Switch tries to end the relationship, Dr. Jerky retaliates by kicking her out of her research assistant position and starts spreading rumors about her competence.
Ugh, that's just low. It's such a clear abuse of power. You can see how vulnerable graduate students are in these situations where their academic and professional futures are so intertwined with the goodwill of their professors.
It really underscores the responsibility faculty have to foster an environment that's safe and respectful for all students. They have to be acutely aware of those power imbalances and act with integrity in all of their interactions.
It's a good reminder for any profession, really. You have to be mindful of how your actions impact other people, especially when you're in a position of authority. And speaking of navigating power dynamics and systems, the book delves into some of the ethical challenges inherent in managed care.
Yes. This is a huge one, and it's something a lot of therapists struggle with.
We see this illustrated in a practice called, and I love this term, creaming and dumping.
Okay, I have to admit, it's a pretty catchy phrase, but the reality behind it is anything but funny.
Right. It sounds kind of delicious, but in actuality, it's anything but. Basically, it's this practice where therapists, some of them, they end up prioritizing profits over the well-being of their clients. So they cherry-pick those clients who are likely to need less time, less resources, kind of the cream of the crop.
Right, the ones who are, quote-unquote, easy to work with.
And then they refer, or to put it bluntly, dump the clients who have more complex needs, often to community mental health centers that are already stretched thin and dealing with long wait lists.
It's a huge ethical dilemma because these therapists are essentially putting their bottom line ahead of the very people they're supposed to be helping.
It really highlights that tension, right, between our obligation to our clients and the limitations of the system we work within. Like, how do you balance those competing demands?
Exactly. And the book illustrates this with a case about a therapist, Mr. Luker, who sees a new client, Miss Poor, for just one session. He quickly realizes that she's dealing with some really significant issues that are probably going to require long-term therapy.
Okay, so you've got this new client. She's clearly struggling, but then what?
Well, here's the thing. Miss Poor has very limited insurance coverage. So instead of really taking the time to try to work with her, maybe help her navigate those limitations, Mr. Luker refers her to a community mental health center that's known for having an incredibly long wait list.
Oh, wow. So he's basically just passing the buck, hoping someone else will deal with it.
It's a classic example of creaming and dumping in action, and it highlights the need for therapists to be more than just rule followers. We need to be advocates for our clients.
So sometimes that means getting creative, challenging the system, or even taking on some financial risk, right?
Absolutely. Because ultimately, ethical practice is about doing what's in the best interest of the client, even when it's hard, even when it means going above and beyond. And that can be really challenging, especially in a system that often feels designed to prioritize profits over people.
Well, I think that's a powerful message to end on. This whole conversation has really been a reminder that ethical practice isn't just about memorizing a set of rules or avoiding getting sued.
It really isn't.
It's about cultivating this ongoing awareness, this commitment to doing what's right, even when it's difficult, even when there's not a clear answer.
Absolutely. It's about constantly striving to uphold the integrity of the profession and, most importantly, to prioritize the well-being of those we serve. And sometimes that means having the courage to challenge the status quo and fight for a better, more ethical way of doing things.
Well said. This has been such an insightful deep dive, and I hope it's given our listeners a lot to think about as they navigate the complexities of ethical practice in their own lives.
Me too. Thanks for having me. This is great.
It was my pleasure. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you next time.